Just explaining the world, but changing it. You're listening to WBPU LP St. Petersburg.
Hi, this is Rick Brown inviting you to stay tuned to the Jazz Zone, hosted by Tien Providence.
songs of Buster Williams from his album Crystal Reflections, featuring Roy Ayers on vibraphone. We heard the track Prism. Before that, we heard the Gerald Wilson Orchestra from the album Golden Sword, which unfortunately got a little cut there. We heard Blues Latinese. I'll correct that when we put it back up, when we put it up on Mixcloud. Yes, there we go. Alright, let's tell you a little bit more about him. Decide giving you a taste of his varying styles of music. He was best known for his composition Everybody Loved the Sunshine, Lifeline, and No Stranger to Love, and others that charted in the 1970s. At one time, Ayers was listed among the performers whose music was most often sampled by hip-hop artists and rappers. I'll give you some more music, more information about him, but let's check out his work with the man Curtis Amy. And he worked with a lot of, well, he was from the West Coast, and most of his work was sort of, in his early years, was with West Coast bands, and Curtis Amy is one of the major forces out in West Coast in those days. This is a track composed by Curtis Amy, and it's called For Ears Only. Curtis Amy. Sounds of one of his early employers, the man Herbie Mann, from an album called Memphis Two-Step. We just heard the title track, featuring, of course, the great Roy Ayers on vibes on that. And we started off with a track taken from Curtis Amy's album, Tipping On True, captured live as a live performance at the Lighthouse, which was a major meeting place for a lot of musicians back in the day, Hermosa, California. And there's so many great recordings out of that club, Lighthouse. And the track we played was For Ayers Only, a track written by Curtis Amy, specifically for the man Roy Ayers. All right, let's tell you a little bit about his early life. He was born in Los Angeles. He was born Roy Edward Ayers Jr. on September 10, 1940, and he grew up in a musical family. His father played trombone and his mother played piano, so he had a great start. At the age of 5, he was given his first pair of vibraphone mallets by none other than the man Lionel Hampton. The area of Los Angeles that Ayers grew up in, South Park, became later known as South Central, was at the center of the Southern California black music scene. He growing up there, he attended Thomas Jefferson High School, a school that was a formative part of the Central Avenue jazz scene and produced various talented musicians, including the great Dexter Gordon. During high school years, Ayers sang in his church choir and fronted a band named the Latin Lyrics, in which he played steel guitar and piano. Let's check out his an album that he recorded, was released on the 32 Jazz record label, fronted by the man Joel Dawn, and featured a lot of the musicians that he'd worked with through the years. He has Gary Batts on this with Charles Tolliver, Hubert Laws, Herbie Hancock is on piano. John Carter plays a couple of bass on a couple of tracks, and Miroslav Vitus also does. Grady Tatum on drums. This is his version of Jobim's Wave. Make sure, yes, Wave. This is Roy Ayers from Stone Soul Picnic.